They didn't know I was in Congress, they just knew I had a dog, a big golden one. And in their perfect little world of garden gnomes and gravel walkways, that was enough to declare war. Max wasn't just a pet, he was my lifeline, a trained service dog who had pulled me out of more nightmares than I could count. After 2 tours overseas and 10 years on Capitol Hill, I thought I had seen every kind of fight. I hadn't seen this one coming. When I moved into Oakridge Estates, I just wanted peace. A quiet home where Max could rest his hips in the sun and I could finish drafting my housing reform bill, ironically the same kind of bill that might have prevented what was about to happen. The place had a picket fence, a tiny garden, and a front porch swing that reminded me of my childhood. It was perfect. For 2 weeks, everything was calm. Neighbors smiled. Lawn sprinklers hissed softly in the evening. Max would sit beside me while I worked, ears perked, tail gently wagging with every bird that fluttered by. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I found a pink slip on my front door. Scribbled in black Sharpie, barely legible through the rage, was my first HOA violation. Unauthorized animal. Large dogs prohibited. Fines begin immediately. I chuckled at first, thinking it had to be a mistake. Max was federally protected. And this was America. We don't penalize veterans for their service animals. Right? I didn't even get to finish my coffee before I met her. She marched across my lawn like she owned it. Perfect posture, matching jogging outfit, and a sneer you couldn't pay to soften. "You must be the new neighbor," she said. "Karen Martinez, HOA Community Standards Chair." "James," I replied, "and this is Max. He's a service dog." She didn't even look at Max. "We don't allow large breeds. They lower property values. It's in the handbook." "He's federally protected," I said gently, reaching into my pocket for his documentation. But she waved it off. "You don't look disabled," she added. That one hit harder than I expected. Max nudged against my leg like he knew. He always knew. Karen snapped a few pictures of Max, my yard, my house, and disappeared with a warning. "This isn't over." I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning I woke to find "Violation" spray-painted across my garden fence in red. My security camera caught a figure in a hoodie. Karen stood nearby pointing. The timestamp read 5:57 a.m. That afternoon, Barbara Thompson arrived at my doorstep. The HOA president. Pearls, clipboard, a voice sweet enough to sour milk. "Mr. Sullivan, we're concerned. Large animals don't fit our aesthetic guidelines." I stayed calm. Years in Congress teach you how to smile through a slap. "Is the HOA prepared for a federal discrimination lawsuit?" I asked. Her expression flickered. "I'm just here to help," she said. And like that, she vanished. That evening, Max wouldn't leave my side. He sat by the window, ears twitching every time a car passed. I could feel it in my chest. The shift. The air was heavier. Something was building. And then the flyers appeared, slipped into every neighbor's mailbox. A warning about aggressive dogs in the community with a grainy photo of Max, yawning on the lawn. Karen had circled his teeth in red pen. I saved one. Evidence. That weekend, a neighbor's teenage son snuck onto my yard. My camera caught him planting fake dog poop behind my rose bushes. He mouthed, "Sorry," into the lens. I didn't blame the kid. I blamed the machine behind him. But the moment that told me war had truly begun. A rock through my window, thrown with force. The second one followed right after, and behind it, Karen's shrill voice. "You were warned." Max barked for the first time in weeks. Not loud. Just enough to let me know he felt it too. As I swept up the glass, I looked out over the street I had tried so hard to quietly call home. I knew then that this wasn't going to be a policy debate or a polite letter to the HOA. This was going to be personal. They had picked the wrong veteran to corner and the wrong dog to threaten, and they had no idea what I was about to bring down on them. The day after the rock shattered my window, something changed in Max. He stopped sleeping near the door and started sleeping with his head pressed to my boots, just like he used to when I was stationed in Kabul. His instincts knew something I didn't yet. Something was coming. That morning I found new flyers taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Bright red ink, bold font. Warning, dangerous animal on premises. A zoomed-in photo of Max was printed in the center. The photo had clearly been taken from across the street with a zoom lens, probably from Karen's second-story window. They darkened the image, highlighted his teeth, made it look like he was snarling. But I knew that look. It was Max, mid-yawn. I walked down the street collecting each flyer, every single one. I saved them all in a folder labeled Evidence. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting had been announced. Just 2 days' notice posted to the community bulletin and slipped under my door. No agenda, no details, just a location, a time, and the implication that the meeting would be about me. Max sat beside me as I reviewed the HOA bylaws. 32 pages of rules, amendments, and clauses, but nothing about service animals. Not a word. They hadn't planned for someone like me, someone who knew the law better than they did. I called my chief of staff, Sarah. Start building a file, I told her. Public records, property complaints, board member backgrounds, anything you can get me on this HOA. Her silence on the other end said it all. They crossed a line, didn't they? She finally said. They shot the first bullet, I replied. They just don't know it yet. That evening, while Max rested, I took a walk through the neighborhood. More accurately, I let them see me walk, calm, unbothered, but taking mental notes of every home with a "No Pets Allowed" sign. There were 17. Some had been there for years. Others were freshly printed and zip-tied to decorative posts. On more than one occasion, I saw blinds move as I passed, eyes watching from behind curtains. Not with hostility, but something closer to guilt. One neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Jackson, opened her door just wide enough to slip a note into my hand. Her handwriting was shaky but legible. They're planning something. Be careful at the meeting. No signature. The next day, while trimming my garden, I caught Karen's teenage son, Tommy, crouched near the edge of my yard again. But this time, he wasn't planting anything. He was picking something up. A collar. Max's spare training collar. He looked up, startled when he saw me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "She told me to bring it back." Before I could ask who she was, he sprinted off. And that was the moment I realized something was unraveling. They were growing reckless, sloppy. Later that night, I heard a noise outside. Not shouting, not footsteps, something quieter. I stepped onto my porch and found a Ziploc bag on my welcome mat. Inside, dog treats laced with blue pellets. Rat poison, labeled "Do Not Eat" from a pest control box. Max would never have touched them. His training was too solid, but my hands shook as I zipped the bag shut and called the police. The responding officer, young and unsure, took the evidence but didn't sound confident it would lead anywhere. Still, I made sure he wrote a report, and I kept a copy. By morning, my phone was buzzing. Sarah had found something. Something big. "They're misusing federal grant money," she said. "Your HOA president's husband runs a landscaping company. He's been billing the HOA for beautification projects that don't exist." I stared out the window as Barbara Thompson walked across her lawn, clipboard in hand, waving at a neighbor like she hadn't just tried to poison my dog. "They're doing it under the guise of HOA improvements," Sarah continued, "funneling the cash through contracts no one's ever audited. Want the documents? Print them, full color, bring them to the meeting." That night, Max laid his head in my lap while I reviewed every invoice, every grant application Barbara's HOA had submitted in the last 2 years. They were sloppy. They never expected anyone to look. I kissed Max on the head. "They thought they were fighting a guy with a dog," I whispered. "They're about to find out they picked a fight with a man who writes the laws they're breaking." The meeting was scheduled for the next evening. And as I turned out the lights and locked the door behind me, I glanced down at Max. He was already sitting by the door, ready. By the time I arrived at the Oak Estates clubhouse, the air was already electric with unease. Folding chairs scraped against polished wood floors, Neighbors fidgeted with their phones, whispering behind cupped hands. Some couldn't meet my eyes. Others nodded silently, guilty sympathy written in their faces. I walked in with Max at my side, head high, folders in hand. No suit this time, just jeans and a jacket. I wanted them to see me as they always had, but not as they still thought I was. Barbara Thompson stood at the front of the room beside the HOA seal, pretending not to notice the hush that followed me. Karen was seated 2 rows back, arms crossed, an overly dramatic neck brace around her shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. A performance through and through. "Before we begin," Barbara announced with faux poise, "I'd like to remind attendees that this is a closed community meeting. Recordings are not allowed." Too late. A dozen phones were already tucked into jacket pockets, running. Not by me, but by others. Quietly, cautiously. The tide had started turning. Karen stood. "I'd like the minutes to reflect that the dog in question is present and that several of us feel threatened." Max didn't move. He sat stoically, eyes forward, leash loose. He was the calmest soul in the room. "I'd also like to enter Exhibit A," Karen continued, holding up a blown-up photo of Max mid-bark. "This is from Tuesday when he—" "That's a yawn," I said flatly. "Anyone who's ever owned a dog knows that." Laughter snuck from a few corners of the room. Karen flushed. Barbara raised a hand. "Let's maintain order, please. Now, as you all know, the board has received several complaints about Mr. Sullivan's dog, as well as concerns over his conduct." "Let me stop you there," I said calmly, stepping to the front. "Because if we're going to talk about conduct, I think we should be thorough." I opened the first folder and handed out copies to the crowd. "This," I said, "is a list of every violation letter issued by this HOA in the last 3 years. You'll see the majority target elderly residents, disabled veterans, and single-parent households." The rustle of paper filled the room as neighbors began reading. "This," I continued, holding up the second folder, "is a breakdown of HOA budget expenses, specifically payments to Thompson Lawn Solutions. That's Barbara's husband's company. Over $90,000 in landscaping charges, not one verifiable invoice." Barbara stiffened. "And this," I added, voice sharpening, "is a formal notice filed this morning with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, accompanied by statements from 4 residents and video footage of HOA members trespassing, vandalizing property, and issuing fabricated citations." Karen's neck brace looked suddenly heavier. She slouched lower in her seat. "You can't bring a federal complaint against a homeowners association," Barbara snapped. "I can," I said quietly, "and I have." A silence rippled through the room. Then came the sound that changed everything. Applause. Tentative at first, then louder. Mrs. Jackson stood clapping. Then the couple from Lot 17. Then an older man in a Vietnam veteran cap. Karen stood, red-faced, her voice shaking. "This is a coup! You're turning neighbors against each other. This man is a threat to our community." A young mother in the back rose. "You made me cry when I put up a swing set. You threatened to fine me for sidewalk chalk." "You're the threat." "Order!" Barbara shrieked, banging a gavel. "This is outrageous." I opened the final folder. "Last item," I said. "This is Max's certification as a federal service animal under the ADA. Every action you've taken against us violates federal disability law." Karen lunged forward, grabbing the papers from my hand. "This is all fake." That's when Max stood, not barking, not growling, just standing between us, his posture firm, steady, protective. The crowd fell silent. Karen took a step back. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she spat. "You don't know what you've started." I looked her straight in the eye. "No, Karen, you don't understand what you've awakened." At that moment, a woman in a dark blazer entered the room. She was followed by 2 men in plain suits with Department of Justice credentials clipped to their belts. "Apologies for the interruption," she said, stepping to the front. "I'm Agent Reynolds with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have a few questions for Ms. Thompson and Ms. Martinez regarding misuse of federal funds and coordinated housing discrimination." Barbara dropped the gavel. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Max sat back down, tail gently brushing the floor. The meeting was over. But the reckoning was just beginning. They thought the meeting would break me. Instead, it broke them. The moment Agent Reynolds took Karen and Barbara aside, the room scattered like leaves in the wind. Some neighbors lingered, offering quiet apologies, handshakes, casseroles. Max, still sore from surgery, but stoic as ever, soaked in the love like a soldier finally home. We walked back slowly, my hand resting gently on Max's back. The air felt different. For the first time in weeks, I didn't sense a target on my back, but I wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. By dusk, Oakridge Estates was under a microscope. News vans camped near the entrance. Neighbors whispered over fences. And the HOA's pristine bulletin board now had a notice of federal investigation tacked dead center. I tried to sleep, but something in me stayed alert. It always did after a battle, those hours after the dust settled, but before the true retaliation arrived. At 2:41 a.m., it came. A sound I'll never forget. A single pop. Not a gunshot, not fireworks, a car alarm shrieking down the street, then two more, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding. Max was already at the window, ears stiff. Then, the glow. A faint, rising orange from the cul-de-sac. Fire. I bolted outside barefoot, robe flapping in the wind. Max right behind me despite the limp. My neighbor's car, Mr. Reynolds, the elderly man with the war medals, was engulfed in flames. Two others nearby were already catching. "Call 911, I shouted, sprinting toward the hose spigot. Mrs. Jackson, in her slippers and nightgown, was already dialing. Lights were flicking on all down the block. But it wasn't just the fire that chilled me. It was the spray-painted message across the garage door, glowing in the firelight. "Traitor." I froze, water sloshing from the hose in my hand. Max pressed close to my leg, trembling. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a warning. The sirens came minutes later. Fire trucks, police cruisers, the red and blue flashes turning our quiet street into a crime scene. Karen and Barbara were nowhere in sight. But Tom, Barbara's husband, stood in his driveway watching. Arms crossed, jaw tight, no phone in hand, no effort to help. The officers went door to door, collecting statements. I handed over the footage from my outdoor cameras, grainy images of two hooded figures throwing something into Mr. Reynolds' sedan before sprinting off into the night. Agent Reynolds arrived by sunrise. She stood beside me on the curb, the early light casting long shadows over the scorched pavement. "You need to prepare yourself," she said. "We've seen this pattern before. When these HOA empires collapse, someone always tries to burn the evidence, sometimes literally." I nodded, eyes scanning the damage. "Max and I aren't going anywhere." She looked down at the dog beside me, the bandage still wrapped around his side. "Neither is he, huh?" "He's taken worse," I said softly. "So have I." And as the tow trucks hauled away the charred vehicles and crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze, I realized this wasn't just a fight over housing codes anymore. It was about fear, what it looked like when power slipped from the hands of people who abused it for years. But they weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what I represented, someone who wouldn't back down, and someone who still had plenty more to reveal. I used to think the worst thing about war was the noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of protest. But now I know the most dangerous battles are fought in whispers. The next morning, Oakridge Estates didn't wake up so much as stagger into daylight. Police cars lingered like ghosts, their lights muted. Max and I walked our block in silence. Neighbors nodded but said little. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Fear was settling in. And fear, I'd learned long ago, makes people either run or dig. I chose to dig. My first call that morning wasn't to the press. It was to Sarah, my chief of staff, and I gave her the go-ahead to unseal the files. Everything we had on the HOA, every shady fine, every homeowner forced out. But what she found next changed everything. "James," she said, her voice unsteady, "we just uncovered financials going back 10 years, and there's something buried under HOA expense reports. A separate LLC account, off books, registered to a name I haven't seen before." I frowned. "Whose name?" A pause. "Michael Thompson." I stopped cold. Barbara's husband. The same man who stood on his driveway last night watching the flames grow without blinking. The one who claimed he was just the HOA's treasurer. Turns out, Michael wasn't just managing funds. He was funneling them. Tens of thousands of dollars in unexplained maintenance expenses, all routed through a company called Oakhaven Services, LLC, registered in a P.O. box in the next county. And when Sarah cross-referenced the address, it matched the business license of an old contractor, blacklisted for defrauding veterans out of home repair loans. The man had changed his name 3 years ago, but he made one mistake. He used the same bank account. "You're telling me," I said, "Barbara's husband is tied to a veteran fraud ring and he's using our HOA fees to launder money?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Sarah confirmed. "And James, it gets worse." The HOA had taken legal action against 8 homeowners over the last 2 years, citing community violations. But 5 of those homes, they were later bought at foreclosure auctions for half their value by shell companies tied to the same P.O. box. This wasn't just personal vendettas anymore. It was organized theft. It was criminal racketeering hiding behind HOA rules. I leaned back in my chair, Max's head resting on my boot. They thought they could hide it. They thought nobody would look closely, but they didn't count on a congressman living right under their nose. I submitted the entire file to the Department of Justice that afternoon, and then I did something I hadn't done since the fire. I walked over to Barbara Thompson's house. She opened the door slowly, mascara streaked and hands trembling. "Please," she whispered. "I had no idea what he was doing." I handed her a printout of the financial report. "This wasn't Karen's crusade," I said. "This wasn't about Max. You were protecting your husband." She collapsed into the doorway, sobbing quietly. "He told me it was just temporary, that the HOA needed the money, that it was to fix things." "No," I said. "He broke them." "And you helped him cover it up." She tried to hand me an envelope. "It's all here," she said. "Bank statements, passwords, the name of the notary who helped file the fake liens." I didn't take it. "I already have them," I replied, turning to leave. "The DOJ will be in touch." As I walked back home, Max limping beside me, I passed the Thompson house one more time. But this time the door didn't close behind me. It slammed shut, with a sound that felt more like a cell door than a home. And inside my own house, sitting on the front porch, was Agent Reynolds. "We just issued warrants," she said. "But there's one more name that came up in the filings." "Karen?" I asked. She shook her head. "Worse. The title on 3 of those shell companies? Tom Martinez." I froze. "The man who shot my dog?" She nodded grimly. "He's not just HOA security. He was running foreclosure scams across 2 counties, and he's been doing it for years." So this was it. Not just neighborhood bullying. Not just power-tripping board members. This was an operation, a network, a full-blown scheme built on fear, silence, and buried trauma. But they forgot one thing. I hadn't come home to retire. I'd come home to rebuild. And now the bulldozers were on my side. Justice doesn't always roar like a lion. Sometimes it walks into court wearing a quiet suit, carrying boxes of truth, and it doesn't blink. The week following the arrests felt like watching the gears of history grind into motion, slow, heavy, and unstoppable. Max and I sat quietly on the courthouse steps that morning, his injured leg bandaged but healing. He was still stiff, still limping, but he'd insisted on coming. Or maybe that was just me projecting. Either way, we belonged there. Behind us, a growing crowd of supporters, veterans, homeowners, dog lovers, disability advocates, held signs reading, "Justice for Max." HOAs are not above the law. and homes, not harassment. Karen Martinez, Barbara Thompson, and Tom Martinez were each led into the building through a side entrance, surrounded by federal agents. The indictment had hit 2 days earlier, 32 charges across all 3 defendants: fraud, racketeering, animal cruelty, discrimination, conspiracy to interfere with housing rights. But the most shocking revelation? Tom Martinez wasn't just HOA security. He was a former code enforcement officer fired years ago for falsifying documents and reinstated under a fake name through a loophole in a private HOA contracting firm. They'd built the whole scam with one goal: to bleed homeowners dry, seize property, and profit. But now they were the ones on trial. As the court clerk read the charges, I watched Karen fidget with her bracelet, one that had cost her $6,000 of HOA money, according to the forensic accountant's report. Barbara sat with her hands folded like a grieving widow, while Tom's jaw clenched tighter with every count read aloud. And then came my name. Congressman James Sullivan, victim, witness. The judge nodded toward me as I stood, placing a hand gently on Max's back. Every camera turned. "I do," I said, and I told the truth. Not just about the HOA, not just about Max, but about what happens when power is left unchecked, when rules become weapons, when the quietest voices are drowned out by entitled mobs pretending to protect values. I told them about the night my windows shattered, about the fake violations, about the fear in my neighbors' eyes, and how some of them had been fined out of their homes before I'd even moved in. I told them what Max meant to me, not as a pet, but as a partner who'd stood between me and darkness more times than I could count. And I ended with this: everyone thinks Congress is about power, but the real power is what you do when nobody's watching. These people used small rules to commit big crimes, and if not for a service dog, they might have gotten away with it. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Karen was crying, but not from guilt. From the weight of consequences finally crashing down. Outside, the media called it the Max hearing. Inside, it became a precedent. 3 weeks later, the verdicts came. Guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder as she sentenced Tom to 25 years without parole. Karen received 18 years with a federal lifetime housing board ban. Barbara, who had pled guilty and cooperated late in the game, was given 10 years and stripped of all public and HOA privileges. But none of that brought back the homes they stole. None of it erased the trauma they inflicted. That's why, after the trial, I didn't celebrate. I went back to Oakridge Estates, and I helped rebuild. We repainted fences without asking for permits. We removed every no pets sign from every gate. We tore down the old HOA board's meeting shed and replaced it with a community library, named in honor of a certain golden retriever, Max's Corner. Every resident, no matter their age, background, or disability, could sit there now, in peace. And just last week I watched Max hobble up the steps and lie on the porch with a soft sigh. A place that once fined us for flowers now planted them freely. But justice, real justice, still needed more. That's why I went back to Washington. And on the floor of the House, I introduced a bill, the Service Animal Protection and Housing Accountability Act. It passed with bipartisan support in under 3 weeks. Because the story wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the thousands who didn't have cameras, who didn't have a voice, who didn't get their Max back. But now, maybe they'd get something else. Protection. Sometimes the battles that matter most aren't fought overseas or in the halls of Congress. They're fought in quiet neighborhoods, over fences, flowers, and the right to feel safe in your own home. For me, this wasn't just about an HOA. It wasn't even just about Max. It was about the slow erosion of dignity that happens when power goes unchecked, when rules meant to protect are twisted into tools of cruelty. I watched as neighbors were fined into silence, bullied off their land, and made to feel like strangers in their own communities, all in the name of property values. but values aren't about the length of your grass or the color of your front door. They're about how we treat each other when no one is watching, about whether we step up when someone weaker is being pushed down, and whether we see the people next to us not just as neighbors, but as fellow human beings. Max reminded me of that. In every moment he stood beside me, calm, loyal, unshaken. He showed me what quiet strength looks like. And when he fell, protecting me from people who mistook power for authority, it changed everything. It reminded me that silence enables abuse, that titles don't make someone just, and that real leadership doesn't come from committees, gavels, or bylaws. It comes from doing the right thing, especially when it's hard, when it's costly, and when it makes you a target. To anyone who's ever felt powerless against a system rigged to intimidate you, know this: you are not alone. There are more of us than there are of them, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing up for the rest to remember they still can. Max may never walk the same again, but he walks free, and so do I. Because when fear runs a neighborhood, we call it control, but when courage returns, we call it community. So to every HOA bully, every corrupt board member, every Karen who ever used rules to silence the vulnerable, just know, there's always someone watching. Sometimes with a camera, sometimes with a badge, and sometimes with a bill heading straight to the floor of Congress, and we will not be silent again.